Hi, my name is Jared, and I'll be doing a presentation on army ants as a keystone species. So in this presentation, I'll be discussing what a keystone species is, as well as the background information of army ants. I'll also be discussing their raids and their effects in the forest, as well as different species that rely on these ants. So a keystone species is defined as a species in which other species in the ecosystem largely depend on, such that if you remove them from the environment, the ecosystem would be changed drastically. A keystone species can be anything from a small, inconspicuous plant to a large apex predator. There are three kinds of keystone species. There's predators, ecosystem engineers, and mutualists. A keystone predator is an organism that helps control the populations of prey species, which in turn affects organisms along the food web. An example of this would be the jaguar, as they help keep the herbivores of the Amazon in check from eating and destroying plant populations. An ecosystem engineer would be an organism that creates or changes an ecosystem in some way. So a typical one for this would be a beaver. They cut down trees and then they use these to build dams, which blocks up waterways. Finally, there's keystone mutualists, which have mutually beneficial interactions, more particularly specialized mutual interactions, like with plants and their specific pollinators. So an example would be hummingbirds and their highly specialized plants. Army ants are also a keystone species, as they're important for many species of vertebrates and invertebrates. Army ants play a key role in the dynamics of tropical forests because of how they regulate the populations of other social Hymenoptera, as well as locally impact a leaf-litter arthropod community. They also support the community of specialized birds, which gets most of their foods from the arthropods, but I'll get into that to further slides. So one of the army ants in the Amazon rainforest is the Achaeton burchellii, which are in the order Hymenoptera, and they're also eusocial species, which you would typically think of for ants. Eusocial species are defined by having cooperative brood care, as well as overlapping generations within a colony, and the division of labor and reproductive and non-reproductive groups. One caste usually loses the ability to reproduce and helps take care of other siblings. Other eusocial species include bee species, termite species, and there's even some mammals like the naked mole rat that's eusocial. Colonies can be anywhere from a couple 100,000 ants up to 500 to 600,000 ants, which is very, very big. The ants prey on invertebrates and small vertebrates that cross their path. This includes like small rodents, or they can even overcome small birds sometimes. The colonies consist of workers, soldiers, reproductive males, and queens, or just one queen in this case. At night, the ants will gather into a large mass called biovacs to rest instead of having permanent colonies like you would typically think of. They can't actively thermoregulate, so they have to rely on the location and architecture of their nests in order to keep the temperatures regulated, which I thought was kind of cool. So just to show you a size comparison, the smallest one is 7 millimeters is the workers, small sterile females, which 7 millimeters isn't terribly small, but compared to their next one up, which is the soldiers, it's kind of small. And soldiers are larger than the workers. They have the large pinches, which you can very easily see. I'll show you a picture in the next slide, which is a very defining feature. Look at them. Next up, a little bigger than that, at 29 millimeters, or a little over an inch, is the males, which the males are the only ones to actually have wings. And when they're born, they typically leave right after in search of a female in another colony to reproduce with. And finally, the biggest of the four is the queen. They have no wings, and they actually mate with multiple males in the colony. So here's the actual pictures. You can see in the top left, you will see that is the male, the only ones that have wings. They have that large abdomen, they're a little bit smaller than the queen. To the right of that is the soldier, and there you can see the very defined large mandibles that it has in its body. And then it's bigger than the worker ant, which you can see in the bottom right corner of that picture. Just below that, you can see the worker ant, which looks to be carrying something back to the colony. And then to the left of that, you can see right in the center of the picture is the queen. Kind of looks like a cockroach, but it is not a cockroach. So the army ants' life cycle consists of a stationary phase and a nomadic phase of the colony. So during the stationary phase, it lasts about 3 weeks, and at this point, the female lays eggs, and the colony is in a temporary same spot for the duration of that time. Once the eggs begin to hatch, it shifts the colony into a nomadic phase in order to increase their raids and actually provide more food for the larvae. Once the larvae begin to pupate, the colony returns back to the stationary phase and the cycle just restarts all over again. So the army ant raids are these massive swarms that can comprise of hundreds of thousands of workers. Typically, the raids come out with about a third of the colony. So if you have a colony of about 600,000 ants, you're going to have 200,000 ants going out in these raids. The tropical forest floor has a very high number of invertebrate species, and the small insects will hide in crevices and anything they can do, or even stand still, just not to be detected, while some with the wings will fly away in order to avoid the raids. These raids are suggested to contribute to the patchy distribution and the maintenance of species diversity of a tropical rainforest. With the chronic predation by these ants in the forest floor, they're always going around like that, the sudden removal of this species could cause a large increase in insect populations that are affected, which in turn could lead to the decimation of species that those insects prey on, both plants and animals. This is a video that I want to show you real quick of a raid that I found that I thought was pretty interesting to watch. Pull it up real quick.
They spread out along a 10-meter front, sweeping across the forest floor. To find prey, the ants must first touch it. The irony is that this, the most successful hide-and-seek player in the forest, is almost completely blind. It distinguishes the living only by their movement. As long as an animal remains still, it is safe. But the slightest twitch will give it away. Within seconds, the prey is pinned down. Within minutes, it's torn apart at its joints. The more the prey struggles, the more the ants engage. Right across the raid front, prey of all sizes are driven from their hiding places. Even wasps must abandon their homes when the ants arrive. Everything alive in the path of the raiders, overwhelmed by sheer numbers.
So I thought that was a pretty cool video to show just how brutal these raids can be. For these raids, there are other animals that actually attend these raids that will pick off the insects that get stirred up. And one of these specific ones I'll be talking about is the ant birds, which are very big attenders for these raids. So army ant raids don't just provide food for the ants, but they also provide food for these species as well. So ant birds will use an ant following tactic as a way of getting their food. So this method involves following the raids and picking off the fleeing insects or small vertebrates. So while the ants are easy food, they're actually not. You don't typically see them being eaten by these ant birds. There are different kinds of specializations for the ant birds. There's occasionally army ant followers, regular army ant followers, and professional army ant followers. So the occasional ones will follow the raids, but they won't go outside of their territory. So once it gets right at the edge, they stop and they let them continue on their way. The regular followers will follow the ants outside of their territory, but they can also be found foraging as well, so they're not completely reliant on them. Now, if you come on the professional followers, they rely entirely on these ants in order to flush out prey from the forest floor. There was a study done, which I have cited down here at the bottom, that was looking at antbirds being parasites on the foraging ants. Now, in the beginning, I talked about how the possibility of them being mutualists, since they kick up different vertebrate species that can fly, and when the antbirds come down to eat them, they actually push those flying species back down into the raid. But toward the end of the study, when the results came out, they actually showed that the antbirds were more of parasites to the species than they were any kind of mutualism. If you were to remove the army ants completely out of an ecosystem, you would see a severe decline in these professional army ant followers, and possibly in the regular ones as well. So I just want to touch on habitat fragmentation on these ants. Habitat loss and fragmentation has been identified as a key driver in population declines and biodiversity loss in both marine and terrestrial ecosystems. This includes the Amazon rainforest. Tropical rainforests are disappearing at an alarming rate, and it's affecting numerous species in the rainforest. One of these species being the army ant. So because of this reduction abundance of ant colonies in the forest, habitat fragmentation might lower the foraging opportunities for these antbirds, and consequently decimate these populations. So what will happen if continued fragmentation occurs and these populations continue to decline? How will the environment change due to these keystone species disappearing? Some studies should be done in order to figure out the exact impacts that it will have on the environment. So this concludes my presentation on army ants as a keystone species. Thank you for listening.